Armored units have always struggled in Fire Emblem games, unless you're talking about heroes, in which case they've been a menace since time immemorial. In mainline titles, however, their low mobility is a far more detrimental setback. At the cost of low mobility, they're afforded great defenses. Sometimes. But this trade-off proves to be one that doesn't really hold up in value. Fire Emblem's design typically doesn't allow for slow movement units like armors to flourish in gameplay, which, while there is no one strategy to apply to the game to play it, it feels as though armor units are the one strategy you're never meant to apply. I want to look at why this is the case and talk about what I think can be done to remedy the issue. Thinking back to my own experiences in playing Fire Emblem, the only times I've used armors is with Dedue, because I liked him as a character, and I could reclass him anyways, Lucas, because I liked his dialogue, Jade, because she's the love of my life, Louis, because he's the love of my life, Bors, and Debias, if you count Project Ember, because I thought they were really funny. Outside of Louis specifically, every armor unit I've used is entirely because I was interested in their character in some way. None of them really wowed me as armor units. Bors and Debias didn't either, but that's because I gave them 50 boots and let God take the wheel. Naturally, not everyone is going to be some legendarily powerful unit, but why exactly does it feel as though armor units are so forgettable in every game? Well, I'd say the key reason is speed. Outside of being slow to move around, they aren't exactly spry in combat either. I mean, makes sense, they are lugging around a gigaton of armor, but it also leads to the entire class type lacking variety, with the only variation being how hard they hit, or in some cases, if they can even hit in the first place. You'd think a payoff for the weaker armors would be an ability to double occasionally, but no. It usually means they're an armor with a bit of res, leaving them a jack of all trades, master of none. Since most armors evaporate from a gust of Elwind, they offer the slight variety of a unit that doesn't turn to ash from a single L-fire, but they'll still get decimated in like 3 hits. Because they're much slower units, since almost every enemy in the game is going to be capable of doubling them, they're going to get wiped out pretty easily if they aren't the type of armor that takes 0 damage from attacks. That's not even mentioning the games that have flat chip damage in combat, making their only strength non-existent. As games tend to progress, the maps get bigger and bigger, which means armor units struggle more and more to keep up with the pace of the rest of the army. As maps go on, armor units become more and more tedious to keep track of, sliding all the way back just to move them like 5 tiles. For 20 turns, all for them to not even catch up to the army by the end of the chapter, lest we forget Arden. This is doubly an issue in certain games like Binding Blade, where you have specific chapter objectives that require you complete the chapter within a turn count. And if you're needing to bench armors for multiple chapters, you might as well be benching them for the whole game. I mean, it's not like these stooges are even worth your time. This is what a worthwhile investment looks like. Their low mobility would be fine in theory, as you could set up a strong rear defense to protect from an ambush. However, armor units aren't immortal. With the gap between them and the rest of your army, it's very likely for them to get overwhelmed. And as I outlined earlier, very likely will end in their own demise, leaving them to a sad fate of just buying time and maybe clearing a few of the reinforcements. Add to that, armors have low speed, and if they aren't one-shotting, the combat is even slower and less effective. Because of that fact, you're better off just letting a section of your forces manage any ambush, while the rest stave off the offensive on the front. This is also assuming the game has reinforcements frequently enough that this niche even exists. Now, by no means am I saying armor knights should be invincible. What I'm saying is, their only niche is hyper-specific and isn't even worth using them for. Armor units sadly serve a better role as enemies, since they're designed to be in your way. As foes, they serve as bulkier enemies that essentially check to see if you're moving your magic units efficiently on the front lines, or if you have armor-slaying weapons. This is especially apparent with the amount of times bosses tend to be armored, since they become damage sponges. By the game's own design, you're never meant to be in the way of the enemy, save for very specific chapters. But then, their only use is relegated to those specific chapters, and it's not like you need them to fulfill that role. In terms of armor units as characters, I'd say there's another subtle issue in that regard. Because of the nature of armored units, they're typically duty-bound knights serving a royal. This makes it so a lot of characters don't stand out as much since they've got a very bland background to go off of, if you're even giving them a chance as a character. Jade is my favorite armor unit in any game as a character because even though she is a duty-bound knight like most of her contemporaries, she's a writer. A comedy writer, even. I want to make a dedicated video on her at some point, so I won't dwell on it too long here, but the point is that she felt like a refreshing departure from the usual duty is my entire personality mold that has plagued armors. But various different things in design around her being an armor unit doomed her to obscurity. I'd like to see more armored units that aren't these typical knights. This way they don't have this same specific mold for all of them. But this is all to highlight the fact that this class type as it is now is genuinely a curse for characters. So even if they started putting more unique spins on them as characters, it would end up being a wasted effort. So how do we go about breathing life into this unit type mechanically? By providing it with more unique gameplay elements. Armor unit exclusive skills are the easiest start. I don't know that I'd like to see hero skills flood into the mainline games, but there is a principle to pull from them. They're the save skills that revolve around armor units taking attacks for ally units. Engage had a similar design on martial monks instead of armors, which made it really stupid, honestly. But the principle of using armors as units that provide general defensive buffs is great. In the games that had pair-up mechanics, this idea was always kind of there. Obviously, you could pair up any unit type, but I think seeing it fleshed out into a legitimate mechanic for armors in mainline games could provide them with far more useful gameplay utility. Armors could also have skill design that takes advantage of them being left behind, becoming far more resilient when they're far behind. Like if there are more enemies than allies within a certain radius, they gain additional benefits in combat. For all the hate I have for Engage, and oh boy do I hate it, the emblems opened up a lot of interesting mechanical design in general. The Sigurd emblem could give armored units cavalry movement. This felt extremely liberating. I think armor units should have access to some variation of a temporary skill like this. Obviously, if they could just move around like this all the time, they'd be no different from a paladin, but having it tied behind a temporary mechanic actually introduces a new element of strategy to the game, especially if there's an added drawback applied for balancing. Alternatively, weapon levels have always been around, and Three Houses made unit building a massive sandbox with them all being possible to boost. While you don't have to bring back that massive sandbox design, I think the same principle could be applied to armor itself, making units that increase their armor skill possible to have higher mobility in armor. This could also affect their combat speed in armor as well. Another change that could be made to armor units is actually making their armor customizable equipment. This leaves room to apply unique effects onto armor units specifically, like an armor that feels light when moving, but weighs a ton in battle, making it so they have high movement but lose out on accuracy in combat, which to then offset would require you use a weapon with far better accuracy, creating a sort of sandbox just for armor units. This is the sort of thing that could reinvigorate their place in the games. Outside of this idea, there can also be armor designed for unique terrain, gaining additional benefits depending on the map and where they are on it. I don't know how you'd go about implementing camo armor, but as an example, camo armor, while in the forest, can drastically increase their evasion, giving them a way to potentially get around their weakness to tomes. But in saying this, I get the feeling IS would rather apply that to a boss to drive the player insane instead. The main point is that there should be more depth to the armor units to give them a more unique role in gameplay. Armor units can also struggle to get kills unless their attack or crit is absurdly high enough to one-shot regularly. Giving them situational follow-up skills can also help alleviate that issue with their design. They can still get doubled themselves, but more chances for them to actually kill would greatly improve their utility in games. Fates gave them Wary Fighter, which allowed for them to actually be a legitimate strategy in that game. Expand on those unique skills that help set them apart from other classes. To add to skills that play off of their own weaknesses, turning them into a situational advantage. If they're slow enough in comparison to the enemy, they could have a skill that reduces damage or even boosts their evasiveness. A skill that reflects a sort of mastery in combat and the ability to maneuver well against speed, being able to use your opponent's speed against them. You could also implement a skill with similar functionality to my idea with the custom armors, providing more movement at the cost of accuracy. Say an armor unit has its normal movement, but after completing a movement action, they can move again. But for every tile they move forward in this second move action, their accuracy decreases by a set value for each tile the rest of that turn. Other than skills and customization, they should have unique game objectives to complete. Thieves have a role of completing optional objectives like opening doors and looting chests. Armor units having a similar utility on maps would also help validate the usage of them. I mean, in Genealogy, they were well aware of how useless armors were with the game's map design and opted for you to use them to defend the castle. It wasn't that great, but it's at least something. Maps tend to have destructible walls and barriers. You could expand upon that concept with armors, maybe making destroying them a free action for armor units, or even adding more depth to it by the environment changing if an armor unit destroys it. Let's just say when other units destroy the barrier, it makes an opening, but if it's an armor unit, they wholly destroy it, leaving the surrounding area covered in debris, of which affects the hit rates of those standing in those areas. So you have your armor knight in a choke point where there's no debris, and all the areas they can be attacked from have decreased hit rates, leaving them with an opportunity to safely tank. Of course, this is tied to specific interactables, so I'd hope to see more interesting roles for armored units to perform on maps. They could start designing more chapters with armor units in mind. It's not uncommon for chapters to start with your forces split up. There could very well be chapters designed in a way that you have a defensive force and an offensive force that you have to balance, protecting a plot important character inside a stronghold while also picking off the numbers outside so as to not get overwhelmed. It's a more involved version of Arden's role in Genealogy. Naturally, other unit types can fulfill this defensive role all the same, but it's a scenario where armors can actually perform well in, so finding ways to provide them with greater advantages than other unit types in these scenarios would boost their viability drastically. Maybe being able to move large blockades, staving off points of access for enemy forces, or maybe even open up advantageous routes for your own units, baiting an enemy to an entry point, then shutting it off, allowing ranged units to pick them off. I would only hope that this is just one form of applying them to the actual game's design. It becomes stale if these types of chapters are their only application. The point is trying to find more ways for the player to actually get their armor units in the way of the enemy, giving armors an actual chance to perform an important role. Speaking of important roles, we could actually have an armor unit as the protagonist. A lot of plots tend to revolve around a MacGuffin sword. What if you've switched it up and had a MacGuffin armor? This can tie in with my earlier idea and customization of armor for armored units. Go crazy, give the armor a skill tree for all I care. Just introduce any way to add more depth to this unit type. Having the protagonist be an armor unit serves as a strong encouragement for playing around with this system, as you will be forced to directly use it. It's an opportunity to set it apart while also experimenting with improving the role of armor units. When I asked people if they'd be interested in a Fire Emblem with an armor unit protagonist, under the pretense that doing so was an attempt to move armor units forward in design, people seemed at least receptive to the idea, with most people saying yes, and others withholding their judgment depending on the implementation. I don't think it's realistic, but I do think it would be the greatest initiative towards building a new legacy for this oft-disregarded unit type. Edelgard was technically a case of this, but she's in that same weird protagonist purgatory that Crom's in, where they're the protagonist, but they're not actually the protagonist. Normally you'd call that a deuteragonist, but that implies they have the same weight as the protagonist, which, you know, they're technically important, but their personalities weren't, apparently. Also, Edelgard's in a reclass game. Sure, her unique class is almost definitely better to use anyway, but it feels like a half-hearted step in the right direction. I want to see IS put their best foot forward. I don't believe armor units are useless as a concept. However, I do think their current implementation has made them feel that way. I just wanted to highlight why that seems to be the case, and hopefully illustrate good ways to start changing that fact. I'd like to shout out ActualLizard and ActualLizard's videos on armors, as they did serve as points of reference for certain ideas. I just felt like there were some things I wanted to expand upon personally. Here's to hoping more discussion about the poor reputation of armors actually amounts to them improving, or someone just makes a fan game with all armors.